So, Sunday mornings, going through the kind of the plan of redemption and looking at things, we were talking about a portrait of David's heart. We were there in 2 Samuel, just kind of looking at what's going on there, and might be a slight change to this class in the near future, and maybe changing things up, not to where we're not looking at the plan of redemption, but perhaps looking at it more chronologically instead of kind of going, one book to book to book to book, and that may help see things a little bit clearer as what is our history has unfolded. Have to wait and see. Okay, so talking about David, and we looked at the portrait of David's heart. We talked about the reverence that he had for God's way. Well, relative to his conduct, the darkest days of his life would be involving what? Bathsheba. His adultery with Bathsheba, and what is in connection with that? Murder. His murder of Uriah. David, he laid the foundation really for his adultery by rejecting God's original design for the marriage state that we have there in Genesis chapter 2. Therefore, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will be one flesh, right? And so he had rejected that. His household, it was one of polygamy. Had many wives, had concubines, various children, and really it was a disaster area. Now, and when we think of concubines, in the Old Testament, it depends on the context, okay? Because a concubine can also refer to someone who is not the first wife, right? You've got those shows like Sister Wives and stuff like that. You've got first wife, and you've got the second wife, and the third, and the fourth, and so on. Well, sometimes is that a concubine, it's not referring to someone who is just, a part of a relationship with a married individual, but it could be referring to someone who is just simply not the first wife. You can jot down 2 Samuel chapter 3. 2 Samuel chapter 3. I can get my pages to unstick here. And you have this house of David, it says. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David, it was long. David grew steadily stronger, but the house of Saul grew weaker continually. And it starts off listing this kind of short genealogy. This is something that really speaks today. Not to spend too much time on it, but there is, natural desire for men, natural desire for women that is granted by God. And the design of culture would be to say, go with whoever you want to. It doesn't matter how many people you're with sexually or anything. And whereas that is God's design is to be, just, husband and wife, the two joined as one flesh, right? David rejected that. And so that really kind of lays the foundation for everything just going downhill. That was Paul's point in 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 18. 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 18, every sin that a man does is without the body, but he that commits fornication sins against his own body. So there is a connection there to God's design that's found in Genesis chapter 2. You might hear this term in popular culture and what have you of a body count. Body count essentially being how many people has that particular individual had sexual relations with. And to give you an idea of where culture is, there is kind of an unwritten standard that for a woman it should be under 20, but for a guy it can be 300 or more, and that's fine. That's where the culture currently is. Yeah. And so it's really a rejection of God's individual design. There's nothing wrong, and I'm mentioning this because, again, David's dark day was really that adultery with Bathsheba. There's nothing wrong with sexual desire. It is there by God. It's an emotion that's planted in us. I know it's an uncomfortable subject, maybe, for some, right? But we're all adults. But it's there by God. However, God designed that to be within the marriage unit, right? And the other thing, too, is you have people, even Christians, who will say, well, I'm pro-traditional marriage, or I'm for traditional marriage, right? Okay? That's the wrong thing to say. It's wrong to say that you're for traditional marriage. The reason being is because traditions change. Traditions change with culture. You could say that in 100 years, people saying I'm for traditional marriage, and the traditional marriage might not be between a man or a woman, right? So it's more of a matter of I am for biblical marriage, right? And so David, he obviously had his issues with that. And it really is frightening, or it should be, to think that man intruding on a work of God that involves one of the most intricate aspects of his nature, that going in there and kind of messing it up, it destroys a barrier that God created. And, it's not just the nature of a man and a woman being together. It's beyond that. It's being joined in marriage. And we look to the New Testament and we consider how are husbands supposed to love their wives. Right, as Christ loves the church. Right? What is the church called? The bride of Christ? Well, yeah, the body of Christ, but in this context that we're kind of looking at, the bride of Christ. I don't read anywhere in Scripture where the Bible says, that the church is the concubine of Christ. Right? And so it's more than just a matter of a man and a woman versus other things. It's God's design. And the mental, emotional, and physical and spiritual framework out of which David's adultery with Bathsheba arose, it didn't originate with this kind of lonely, idle time. You look at 2 Samuel chapter 11. 2 Samuel 11 and verse 2. When evening came, David arose from his bed and walked around on the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful in appearance. I think I said it last week. Kind of reminds me of that scene in Back to the Future when Marty looks up at his dad in the tree with the binoculars, and he's like, he's a peeping Tom. That's David here. It's not some idle thing. And so the seed really for David's sin with Bathsheba, it was planted when, it didn't just start here, right? It wasn't just, he went on the roof, he saw Bathsheba bathing, and that was the end-all, be-all. It didn't start there. It started much earlier when he supplanted God's will for one wife. Because he had multiple wives. There were concubines, and there were children by them. And so, it's kind of that slippery slope. He started with one wife, and then, add a second, add a third, add these, and these, and these, and then it doesn't even matter, right? There's no moral framework with which he's able to operate. And so just seeing her, hey, I can add another. because he had supplanted God's original design for it. And so he wounded and weakened himself, and he opened up the door really for Satan to operate in this area of his life. And so when it comes to us as Christians, one of the things that we have to do is see where we are weak in our own lives. Sometimes that might require asking other people, because, we're very close to the situation, and sometimes outside people, they can see what we can't, right? But it does require a deep introspection, and where am I running amiss in my own life? Because I can guarantee you that's where the devil's going to attack. That's the chink in the armor, right? It is looking for that weak spot for the sword to go through. And so Satan, he saw that, and this was another opportunity for it. Thoughts or comments so far? Okay. So, subsequent to David's sin involving Bathsheba and Uriah, Amnon, David's firstborn son, raped Tamar, his half-sister. That's over there in 2 Samuel chapter 13. And David's own sin rendered him impotent in dealing with the sin of his son. There's a son that is there, and his son sees his dad. It's just kind of breaking it down, right? He sees his dad, multiple wives, concubines, whatever, women second class, I can do what I want, doesn't really matter. Goes off and, rapes his half-sister Tamar. What's David going to do? Yeah, it's, well, Dad, I'm just kind of repeating what I see you do. So how is that any different? And it hasn't changed. Children often, follow the example of their parents. There is, of course, a choice that the individual has to make. I'm reminded of a story of two brothers, and one of them, he was just a miserable alcoholic. He was drunk all the time, lived in poverty and what have you. The other one was really well off, nice house, great job, well kept, he was in shape and all this type of stuff. And someone went to each of the brothers and they said, well, what made you this way? And the one who was in poverty and all of this, he said, my dad was an alcoholic. Went to the other one, what made you this way? My dad was an alcoholic. So, yes, there is an example that we have to set, but at the same time, there are individual choices that a person is going to have to make on their own. His son chose to make this choice based on what he had seen his dad doing. And so often we think that children see a lot more than what we think they see. And they hear a lot more than we think they hear. Some of us, like me, learn that a little bit later. Raising kids, as parents know, does not come with an instruction manual. Well, it does, right here. But some of us get to the instructions a little bit later than others. Some of us treat the instructions like one of those IKEA things. Be like, it's a simple bookshelf. I can put it together on my own. Next thing you know, you end up with a coffee table that looks like it was designed by Picasso. And then you go back to the instructions and you're like, well, I can't take it apart now. The idea being is that children often follow in the footsteps of their parents. And for 2 years, Absalom, he plotted revenge for his sister's shame. And his moment came at a sheep shearing festival. where he stained his servant's sword with the blood of his half-brother. And then Absalom fled, and for 5 years it passed before Joab tried to bring reconciliation between David and his son. And those years, they just kind of enabled the seed of bitterness to sprout and grow within the heart of Absalom. He started to scheme and extort the kingdom from his own father. 2 Samuel 15 and verse 6. In this manner Absalom dealt with all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole away the hearts of the men of Israel. Because what he would say, if you look at the preceding verses, like verse 2, Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way to the gate, and when any man had a case to come to the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, "From what city are you?" And he would say, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "See, your words are good and right, but no man listens to you on the part of the king." Then Absalom would say, "Oh, that one would appoint me judge in the land, then every man who has any case or judgment could come to me, and I would justify him." And when a man came near to prostrate himself before him, he would stretch out his hand and take hold of him and kiss his feet. And so think about it, it is, people coming into the city. They want David to hear their judgment. Absalom, he's there at the gate. When they approach, he finds out that they're one of the children of Israel. So he prostrates himself, which is not getting on his knees, but it's laying flat on his stomach, grabbing their feet, kissing their feet, saying, "Oh, if someone made me judge, I'd listen to everybody. At any time anybody had a grievance, I would listen to them." And a lot of this is really on the ignorance of Israel as well, because what did one of the things that Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, tell Moses to do? Does anybody remember? Appoint judges. So he appointed 70 judges to hear kind of the lesser matters. Even Moses couldn't hear it all. But Absalom was claiming to do that, and so he started winning the hearts and favor of the people. Kind of his own, Old Testament grassroots campaign. And so people would start to turn on David. And when David learned about it, he left Jerusalem. I mean, it was to such a degree that David fled Jerusalem with his family and those who were loyal to him. And, he goes to the Mount of Olives. His heart is pierced with arrows and grief. Just look at verse 30 there in 2 Samuel 15. But David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives and wept as he went, and his head was covered, and he was walking barefoot, and all the people who were with him each covered his head and went up weeping as they went. I mean, this was a time of mourning. And Ahithophel, who is David's counselor, he turns traitor and urges the people to immediately pursue David and his followers. And he calls for David's death. And if you skip forward just a couple of chapters there to chapter 17, that pleased him. Chapter 17 and verse 4, "And the word was right in the eyes of Absalom and all the elders of Israel." So now, let's just pause here and think about it for a moment. David's sin did not start with Bathsheba. David's sin started much earlier when he rejected God's original design of one man, one wife. Yes, sir?
I've got to ask this now before I forget it.
Sure.
Now, who was Absalom killed? He
The son.
killed, huh?
The son.
And he killed his half-brother?
Well, he raped his half-sister,
Oh.
and then, we've got Absalom who kind of took revenge and killed his brother. Or half-brother, yeah.
I mean, was that I mean, was that not his half-brother or not? Or, that's why I'm asking. I mean, that he killed.
Oh, that he killed, it was his brother.
Oh, it was his brother,
Yeah.
not his half-brother.
Right.
It was his half-brother though, wasn't it? Because
It
he's by
was,
the first
but-
woman.
My
You what?
brother from another mother.
Yes.
Yeah, but when you're looking at the tribes,
It's different back then?
it kind of is because they're from the same tribe, then they're considered a kinsman, and so it would be like a brother. For example, like in the New Testament, we're talking about being, for Christians, like we're adopted sons and daughters, like we've been adopted, right? But Jesus, nor God, ever calls anybody his stepbrother.
Okay.
Like James, for example. James, a brother of the Lord Jesus
So
Christ,
they were
right?
brothers, though.
Right, yeah.
And the daughter he had with Bathsheba was, what was her name?
It was Tamar.
Tamar, okay.
Yeah.
All right, I got it straight. Okay. All right.
Tamar was the half-sister. So David and Bathsheba had a son. Tamar was a half-sister, so a sister from another mother.
Yes.
Okay? His son with Bathsheba raped his half-sister.
Uh-huh.
The other brother comes in and kills him.
He was a half-brother. So anyway, okay, all
Yeah.
right.
We got family problems, okay?
Okay, but I get it. No, you helped. Yeah, that helped. That helped, okay.
So, the genealogy. No.
Yeah.
Because it's about to get real confusing if we go down that route.
No,
So, for the
They're all
sake of
brothers.
argument, we'll just say brother and
Brothers,
sister. Okay, so, but we look at this, and again, what I was saying is that, David's transgression, it didn't start with Bathsheba. It started because he rejected God's design of one man, one woman, one husband, husband and wife. And so he has these multiple wives. He has, these concubines. There's children involved. He sees Bathsheba. She's added in. They have a son. His son looks at his dad, and it follows really kind of the example of his father in that there is no moral boundary, and rapes his half-sister. And so then the brother, we're just saying brother comes in, kills him, and then he goes to the city gate, he's going to the city gate, bowing down to people, making all of these promises. He is really taking it over. It's reached such a point that David and his family and his followers, they have to flee. One of David's followers, Ahithophel, his counselor, he turns traitor and wants him pursued. So David's going to Mount of Olives with his family, and they're weeping and they're grieving over the state of their affairs. But who caused their state of affairs? David did. Because he originally rejected God. But how many people, even today, would say, why is God doing this to me? You did it to yourself. That goes all the way back to Genesis. All the way back. So what did Adam do when God confronted them? This woman you gave me? She gave me some bad fruit. Blamed God for it. Didn't say the state that you're in or you bringing sin into the world. Didn't take ownership of it all, but blamed God. And here David is, not necessarily blaming God right here, but he's weeping over his situation and it's like, it's all your fault.
And people are still like that today.
Yeah.
Consequences.
Yeah. And so, and we consider here also in that David's sin did not just affect David. I mean, it affected all of these other women, these, wives or concubines, but let's just stick with Bathsheba for a second here. So we're just dealing with, two, at the beginning anyways. But his sin with Bathsheba didn't just affect him, it affected Bathsheba's husband. Because he ends up getting murdered. Remember, David says, send him to the front of the battle, and then when he's there, he's in the thick of it, you pull all the other soldiers back. So it's cost David, and because he couldn't control himself, it cost Bathsheba, her husband. It cost Uriah his life. It cost Tamar. It cost his son. It cost him his kingdom. And, because of that, it's affecting all of Israel. And it's all because, oh, go ahead.
Excuse me.
No, you're
Even
fine.
the commanders, that had to obey David,
Right.
they're impacted because they see the deceit of David.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the ripples just.
And it wasn't just him having, relations or laying, if you want to use the old King James, with Bathsheba either. Because when that happened and Uriah comes back for a visit, he's like, hey, go down there to your wife and all of this. And Uriah's like, oh, I can't do that while the soldiers are out in the field. And David's like, let me figure something else out. Let's have them killed.
Well, this is about all the commandments.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I'm kind of backing up a little bit.
Sure.
But, I guess because of David's sin, he had a different, like you're saying, attitude about what happened to Tamar. But I can't help but believe that because David did not do anything about that, it damaged his relationship with Absalom.
Sure.
And that could have been a factor, logically, in my
Yeah.
mind, a factor in Absalom's, desire to rebel against David.
No, absolutely. Absolutely.
Takes matters into his own hands.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And also, in adding to that, it's not like this would have been kept quiet, Everybody knows. Everybody always knows. I can't remember the exact verse. I can't remember if it's in Exodus or Deuteronomy, but it's, behold, you have sinned against the Lord, and you can be sure your sin will find you out. What? The advice of Hushai, David's friend, really kind of counteracted that of David's former counselor, Ahithophel, and the providence of God worked to assure Absalom's defeat. Read that in chapter 17, really beginning in verse 15, and then verse 18, or chapter 18, we have Joab putting Absalom to death. The battle lines were drawn. It was son against father, The child he once knew now coveted his life. He may have started off with a righteous intent in wanting to avenge, if you will, Tamar. But then he falls into covetousness. And a sword is implanted there. Let's see
Now,
here.
David did not want him to kill Absalom, did he?
No. When we get to it, if you look in chapter 18 and verse 33 specifically, then the king trembled and went to the chamber over the gate and wept. And thus he said as he walked, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I have died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." Those were some of the tragic results of David's departure from God's pattern for marriage and the home. And then we come into moving forward. Just kind of is to 1 Kings. Skipping a decent amount because, like I said, for the time that we have, we could be going through this forever. But coming through 1 Kings 1, chapter 1 through chapter 11 covers the 40-year reign of Solomon, with David at the close of his life. His fourth son, Adonijah, refused to allow his father to die in peace. In chapter 1 and verse 6 of 1 Kings, but his father had never grieved him at any time by asking, why have you done so? And he was also very handsome in form. He was born after Absalom. This is talking about Solomon here. So when Nathan and Bathsheba told David of Adonijah's conspiracy, David handed the scepter of Israel to Solomon. And Zadok took who was a priest. Just look at verse 39 in chapter 1. Zadok the priest then took the horn of oil from the tent and anointed Solomon. Then they blew the trumpet, and all the people said, long live King Solomon. Solomon, someone who would be much, much wiser than his father. Solomon inaugurated his reign in righteousness. In chapter 3 and verse 3, it says, Solomon loved the Lord and walked in the statutes of David his father. And in response to God's offer to fulfill his request, Solomon asked for a wise and discerning heart that would equip him to judge and rule over Israel. He didn't ask for riches for himself. He didn't ask for wisdom for himself. But he prayed so that he would be really, when the nuts and bolts of it are that he prayed so that he might be a better servant to God's people. And so God grants that, and he not only grants it, but he gives him more wisdom than anyone, more riches than anyone else, more honor. And he assures him there in 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 13, I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there will not be any among the kings like you all your days. I'm not only going to give you wisdom, I'm not only going to give you what you asked for, but I'm going to give you what you didn't ask for. Oh, yes, ma'am.
Okay, going back, why does the Bible say that what David was after God's own heart? It doesn't sound like he was.
It doesn't, but when we get into the Psalms, and this is one of the reasons why in future classes we're going to try to work it a little bit more chronologically, because when we get past that incident, we have in the Psalms, David's repentance and him kind of returning back to God, Yeah. We all mess up, right?
Yeah.
Why? Come forward. Now, the greatest accomplishment of Solomon's reign was the construction of the temple. 7 years and 183,850 people employed in the temple's construction. And it was the handiwork of God. When David handed Solomon the blueprint, he informed him, and this, you just jot this down, 1 Chronicles 28, verse 19, that all this the Lord made him understand by kind of writing by his hand on him. He'd put it there, even all the work. So the pattern for the temple was God, or God's. First Chronicles 28 and 19.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
By today's standards, how big was the temple that Solomon, because I was talking to someone about this one time, and what they were telling me didn't make sense. In is for, anyway. what-
Well, major portions of the temple are still there.
So it was,
Yeah, I mean, and this is the first, but the temple that's still there, or the portions of it that are still there, that's the second temple, because this temple is gonna end up being destroyed.
so you can compare it to, I mean, was it bigger than a football field, or?
Oh, yeah,
Okay. 'cause-
yeah, it's massive.
Okay. that's-
Especially when you get to, you know, the second temple and you have different courts for different people, like you've got the court of the Gentiles. So Gentiles could go into the temple, but they could only go to this particular
Okay,
portion.
yeah.
You've got the
Okay.
court of women, so they could go into the temple, but only to this particular portion and what have you. So real quick, so Solomon's prayer at the dedication of the temple, it gives a little bit of insight into Solomon's spirituality. If you look at, you know, his understanding of the nature of the God, the need to appropriate the provisions and what have you. And his final words to Israel, 1 Kings 8 and verse 61. 1 Kings 8, verse 61. Let your heart, therefore, be wholly devoted to Yahweh our God, to walk in his statutes and to keep his commandments, as at this day. And then 1 Kings chapter 10 concludes with Solomon at the pinnacle of his wisdom and his wealth and his power. And then tragically in chapter 11, chapter 11 opens with the words, but King Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and Hittites. Solomon knew the afflictions that his father had brought upon himself, and by that same conduct, and he had experienced the bitter fruits of polygamy, whatever lessons he had kind of gleaned from observations, just he had forgotten. It's kind of sad to start off that way. Blessing the Lord, praising God, and doing all of these things. And then now King Solomon loved many foreign women. Any questions or closing thoughts or comments or? Well, I appreciate y'all's time and attention. And like I said, we're going to change things just slightly where we'll see things a little bit more chronologically, you know. So we might, and so for really what that'll mean is we're going to be jumping around books. So, yes ma'am.
Mike, it says here, and I can't hardly believe this, he had 700 wives from royal birth and 300 concubines.
Yeah.
That's a lot of people to keep up with.
Yep.
Maybe you had a book with their names in it, or
Maybe.
a list.
And the one thing we have to remember too is it's kind of like in the book of Esther, is there wasn't necessarily one house that they were all in. They could have been spread out, and it wouldn't. And you know, him being king, it would be that they couldn't just walk in and see him whenever they wanted to. In fact, that would be punishable by death. That they could only come in if he asked them specifically. So you almost have to wonder is that even though recorded he had 700 wives and 300 concubines, how many of those he actually saw? You know? I mean, I can't remember what I had for breakfast 2 days ago or if I had breakfast at all. I'm certainly not going to remember wife number 349.
He probably had somebody to take care of that for him.
Pro-
To keep score.
Even if you had breakfast with one a
Score.
day.
65 days a year.